9 or 10 times in the Old Testament. This description of God as gracious and compassionate.
And he's quick to anger. Let's face it.
And I guess one of the things that is a little shocking about this is, I mean, Jonah knows what kind of, it's not like Jonah is surprised by God's graciousness and compassion, right? Jonah knows how gracious and compassionate God is.
And the crazy thing is, he seems to expect God to show compassion on him.
He certainly seemed grateful for it, you know.
But yeah, when the land goes away, he's indignant.
Yeah. So yeah, he has this image of he knows who God is. He knows what kind of God this is. And yet he resents it when it's not, when that compassion and grace isn't directed at the people he thinks it should be directed to. Himself, apparently, Israelites in general. And I think that's something that ought to pull us up and make us look, because knowing what you're supposed to know about God, being able to say the things you're supposed to be able to say about God, doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're the kind of person that reflects who God is. I don't think I said that very well, but people who are religious, people who can quote the creedal statements about God that are correct, God is love, we sometimes aren't very loving. We're saved by grace, and yet we don't afford that same grace to others. And on it can go. Jesus dealt with this with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, right? The experts in the law, who knew all about the law, knew all about God, and yet couldn't show that same kind of love and compassion to people who were outside their little circle. So I think one of the things Jonah does is it makes us aware of the fact that we can still be stingy toward people and fail to show grace and fail to show love, even though we ought to know better. I'm reading this last couple of weeks, especially after the shootings in Buffalo last Saturday. I'm struck by how easily we can make other people into the enemy, right? And into the problem. And how we can justify in all sorts of ways our anger and our disgust and our and make other people the recipient of all of the stuff that we've built up. And Jonah is just another kind of example of that, I think. Take away my life, he says. It's better for me to die than to live. Does that strike you as an overreaction?
Yes.
That says absolutely, it's an overreaction. I've read some people say, well, Jonah was concerned about being a false prophet. He had said this was going to happen. It's not going to happen. So Jonah says, well, you just might as well take my life, because obviously I think that's a little too generous. I think he's throwing a tantrum.
You'd think that he would be happy that his preaching was effective.
But he's not.
No.
He's not. And that's part of the issue, I think, right? He's not happy about it because these are people he doesn't want to be accepted.
That he be aware of specific atrocities that he wants them to be held to account for.
Yeah.
Or we need to think of those people like we think of the mass shooters of our own time.
Mm-hmm.
Like that.
I mean, we have this so this attitude of his. I'd rather die than share the grace. I'd rather die than share the love of God with these people. Share God's compassion. And God asks a pretty important question: do you have a right to be angry, or is it right for you to be angry? You can translate it both ways, and depending on your translation, you might have one or the other. But the idea is anger the response, Jonah? Is anger the correct response in this situation? So he's giving Jonah sort of a chance. It almost reminds me of like how how a parent might give a child another chance to, are you sure that's the attitude you want to have? Are you sure that's what you want to say? You sure you don't want to take that back? You sure you don't want to say you're sorry? That sort of thing where you can go, let's back up. Let's try again. And so it's almost as though God is trying to get Jonah to back up and try again.
Well, the thing is, this is not a righteous anger. No, there's two different kind of angers, right? Righteous anger versus God, it's a good thing. We all have some of it. Sometimes we see somebody being hurt and they shouldn't be, and then maybe we get angry if the person's hurting the other person. But then you got the worldly evil anger that he's got. There's no good reason for it. So he doesn't have a right to be angry.
Would Jonah say that this wasn't a righteous anger? He might say very well. He might very well say, "This is a righteous anger I have." It's easy for us as human beings. We can even, we can kid ourselves and kid the people around us. Here's why we're mad. Here's why we're angry. Jonah doesn't though seem to even try with that.
Everyone is, and I get it, everyone's trying to rationalize and justify and come up with arguments. I don't think Jonah would try to defend what he's doing. Maybe you all may be just completely different than me, but I've been there. I've done stuff like this. I've gotten just really pissed off about something that I really had no entitlement to begin with. And all of a sudden it's gone. Actually, anyone who drives in Chicago traffic probably has experienced a little bit of that when you didn't have a right to that lane anyway. And so why are you so mad just because somebody jumps in ahead of you? Or so it's not great. And you said he's doing a tantrum, right? But he's very human.
Yeah.
At least I see it that way. And I guess it's very easy to try to not relate to Jonah, but I see myself, and I certainly see kids, but I'm not immune from that behavior in how Jonah is reacting, and I think that's actually clued into by his response. I am angry as I could possibly be. He's not trying to justify it in terms of theology or anything like that. He's just mad and he's caught up in the emotion. But actually, I think what's so charming about this is how gently God handles it, right? Throughout this whole scene, Jonah's not done what God said. Got the fish incident, we got this, and now Jonah's off on another rant about something, and God doesn't blast him. God coaxes him, right, and gently tries to get him off of this. And I'm just hopeful. We're probably a little early for lessons, but I'm just hopeful that this shows how gentle God can be with us when we mess up and we let our emotions get the best of us and disregard what is rational and reasonable because we're just mad about something. So,
and that's I think a really good point. And one of the things that I want to get to is, we should get to, we just did, is that we sometimes read Jonah and Jonah is this, he's like a villain almost, and we don't relate to him like I think we're supposed to relate to. I think we're supposed to read Jonah and go, oh, yeah, I've maybe been there. I've maybe, I've maybe had that attitude, and particularly toward people who weren't like me, or who rubbed me the wrong way, or I was angry at. And how easily we can forget. It's not that, again, it's not that we forget what we know about God, it's that it doesn't matter to us. We're still mad, and we're still angry, and we're still ready to lay into somebody. And we still resent it, that maybe we have to forgive. And maybe
and we may know it, and we may know it's not rational and it's not right, but we still are just really upset about the situation.
Yeah.
It's like kids, right? They can't limit their emotions sometimes. It's just all over, right? They don't have that. Well, as adults, most of the time we can control things, but occasionally it's just too much, and it just irks us no end. And we know it's not right.
And I've had people, try to talk me out of anger before, right? If you have this, somebody tries to talk you down, and you're not hearing it. In the moment, you're not hearing it. You don't. You later go back and go, I regret that I acted that way. But in the moment, you're not hearing it, because it's something that is, has caused pain, has hurt, and or offended, or hurt your pride, or something. So Jonah, and I want to get back to that, but we need to get to this little, I think it's sort of a parable, almost an acted parable. Jonah goes and makes himself a shelter and sits in its shade and waits to see what would happen to the city. It's a sort of puzzling little statement, but it seems like what he's done is he's found himself a vantage point somewhere, and he's built himself a little shelter, and he's going to live there until it's like, I'm going to stay right here until the city gets destroyed. That's almost what it looks like. God's grace and compassion for these people can't possibly last, and I want to be here when it runs out. I don't know, but that seems sort of like what's happening here. And so he makes this shelter, sits down, and then the Lord God provided a vine or a plant, and it grows up over the shelter maybe, and gives Jonah some extra shade from the sun. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. It's an interesting line, right? He's furious. He's angry enough to die because God is going to spare these people. But he's very happy about this plant that's giving him a little shade. Perspective off a little bit, maybe. I mean, are things sort of cockeyed for Jonah a little bit, the way he's thinking of the world, the way he's seeing people, the way he's seeing God. And there's no doubt, right? The Lord provided, just like he provided the fish to save Jonah, he provides the plant to give Jonah some shade. And Jonah is very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm or an insect, some little critter that chewed the plant so that it withered. And then when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." Now let's take stock of the situation, right? He's mad enough to die because God's going to save these people. He's so uncomfortable that he says, "It would be better for me to die than sit out here in the desert," where he's chosen to sit, right? Nobody's told him to sit out there. He's made the decision to sit out there. And now he's furious about that. Now, again, I think some of this, at least for me, hits close to home. I tend to get very upset if The things that make me comfortable and happy are taken away. And I can lose track of the love that God has for other people in those moments. And I can lose track of the relative importance of the things that make me comfortable versus the love God has for the people around us. Now, I'm not saying, it's wrong to live in a nice, comfortable house, or, I don't think that's what this text is telling us. I think it's pointing to how easy it is for we human beings to get our perspectives out of whack. Jonah is so happy that he's got some shade, and then so angry and so upset when the shade is taken away. Meanwhile, he's angry at God for sparing all these people.
It's interesting that it doesn't mention that. I mean, he's grateful for the shade, but it doesn't mention him thanking God for it.
Yep.
It
Right.
almost makes you wonder, because if I was God, which I can't even begin to think like God, but it's like, you don't appreciate this, buddy. I am gonna make you hot. Real hot. The wind's coming, it's dying. You're too big for your britches, as we would say in Tennessee. You just need it. I don't know. That's what I wonder about.
Yeah, and we don't know that Jonah even acknowledges that the plant is from God. As sometimes we fail to acknowledge how our gifts come from the Lord, and how so much of how He's given us so much.
It makes me think too. I was thinking, we were talking earlier about anger, that emotion along with others, but we lose all common sense and rationality, and we can't see straight because of the anger. It kind of hides us from dealing with life in a rational way. And I think here he can't thank God because he's still angry.
Yeah.
Anger is coexisting with the shade, the happiness of the shade, but he can't push past that to even see that it's from God, because he's still very angry. And he, as it says in verse 9, God is still asking him, why are you so angry about all of these things I've provided? But I think the takeaway for me is, when I read this or hear this, is how powerful my anger is, that it can blind me from things that really matter. It can blind me from seeing the things I should be grateful for, even taking wealth or comfortability or being able to walk and talk. We can get so angry that that's what my takeaway is anyway, that anger is powerful.
Yeah, and we lose track of the things God has given us. We lose track also of the value of other people, and especially the value of people who are different from us, which is where Jonah gets into trouble to begin with. The two questions: is it right for you to be angry? In verse 4, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? In verse 9, God is definitely prodding at Jonah in this area of, what is it that makes you angry, Jonah?
Feel preoccupied with pleasure.
What is it that makes you angry? Well, in the first instance, right, what makes Jonah angry is God's grace to those who he doesn't think deserve it. Do you have any right to be angry about that, Jonah? In verse 9, it's his anger about the plant being lost. In both cases, Jonah says, yes, I have a right to be angry. I think one of the things we should take away from this is, if God ever asks you, do you have a right to be angry? The answer is not yes. The answer should be, okay, no, I don't. But at least Jonah's honest, right? I mean, one of the things that we've often talked about is honesty with God, being honest, in the things that we pray and the things that we say to God. The psalmists are very honest, in their anger sometimes. And at least Jonah, he starts in the right direction by admitting, yes, I am angry. I am angry enough to die. And I think I got a good reason.
Well,
But-
he doesn't say he's got a good reason. He just
Well,
points to
yeah, I
the
got a reason. Yeah, right. I'm saying, yeah, it is right for me to be angry, he says. Now, I don't know how he would defend that, as you're saying. I don't know that he would try to make a logical argument as to how it's right for him to be angry. But in the moment, at least, he's even willing to say to God, yes, it's right for me to be angry. The Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. What's he saying to Jonah about the plant, about his anger about the plant? Why does God think Jonah has no right to be angry about the plant?
Don't have nothing to do with it.
You had nothing to do with this plant, Jonah. You
Right.
didn't plant it, you didn't tend it, you didn't make it grow. It wasn't, how big a deal can it be? It wasn't there very long. You've got no right to be angry about this plant. Well, he then turns to Nineveh. Now, why does he turn from the plant to Nineveh? What's the comparison God is making? You didn't tend this plant. You didn't make this plant grow. But here we have this great city, Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals. What's the comparison God's making?
God did tend to Nineveh.
God tended Nineveh. God made Nineveh grow. God made those people and those animals. And I think that's an interesting thing we need to talk about as well. God made those people and those animals in the town of Nineveh. And he says to Jonah, you were mad about this silly plant that you had nothing to do with. Shouldn't I be concerned about this city? This great, he calls Nineveh a great city. Shouldn't I be concerned about this great city full of people that I made and animals that I made? I think it's a powerful conclusion that God brings this story to. And we don't know what Jonah thought about it.
I wish I did. I wish
Yeah,
we
I kind of wish I did too. And then on the other hand, I think the point is to sort of leave it with us, right? To leave it sitting with us. The question in the end isn't what did Jonah do with that? The question is, how do we respond to that? God cares about the Ninevites. God cares about the Assyrians. God cares about, for us, we go, well, yeah, okay, God cares about everybody. But I think it's not that easy, and certainly in our world where it almost seems, if anything, like the differences between people are becoming more stark, and it's there's almost more demarcation between these people and these people and those people and those people, and our concerns can become very limited and very self-focused, and we can sort of make others into the enemy. And this little book reminds us that God cares about what happens to the Ninevites. God cares about what happens to the Assyrians, the villains in the Old Testament, right? That are violent and bent on conquest and who take God's people into captivity. Except they were acting on God's orders, right? They were acting as God's instruments in doing that. The Old Testament is clear on that. And they are created by God as well. And even though they don't acknowledge him, perhaps, and even though they have maybe just come to recognize him at all, God cares about them. And so his compassion and his grace extends to them. It's a wonderful ending. Should I not have concern for the great city? But Ron, you mentioned to see God's gentleness in dealing with Jonah, and his gentleness in dealing with the Ninevites is the same, comparable.
Yeah, and I got to say, I still identify with Jonah. I was actually just thinking that I remember being in New York on business, and things were not going well. Not at all. I mean, it was just not a fun trip. And I remember I got down to the lobby and I had to go someplace. And I realized it was pouring. It just had started to pour. And I thought, oh no. And the hotel actually offered me an umbrella. I was coming back and they offered me an umbrella. And I remember taking the umbrella and walking down Fifth Avenue or whatever it is, about 2 blocks, at which point the umbrella completely collapsed and just was ruined. I mean, was unworkable. And I remember both being absolutely furious, and I mean, I was in my 40s and just realizing I just want to bawl. I mean, it was like the last straw as to what more. And so I get Jonah when
the Lord
he
provided
says,
an umbrella, and he provided a blast of wind to take it away.
I do. I mean, I get, again, he's so human. And I love that line. I am as angry as I could possibly be, because I get that. I was there on that street. And I didn't have a right to that umbrella. It was just given to me, but it was the last straw. And I'm sure for Jonah, he was miserable already. There was this little glimmer of hope, and then all of a sudden it was gone. And it does make the lesson, but I do understand Jonah too. And again, I am grateful for how gentle God was, apparently, with Jonah here. He
handles it. He handles Jonah, as you say, he handles Jonah gently. Do you really have a right to be angry? Let me show you something. Let me remind you of something. Let's make this into a learning experience for you, Jonah. And again, I don't know how Jonah responded to that. I don't know if it's one of those things that he would have to, going home later, it would occur to him, oh yeah, or in the moment, I don't know, but God deals with him through this little, it's kind of a parable, kind of an active parable. As he reminds Jonah, you were so mad about this plan. Well, you have a right to be angry about that plan, especially because you're also angry about this city full of people that I tended and made, full of animals. Why the animals? Why does he mention the animals? This is one of the few places in Scripture where the animals are sort of mentioned as objects of God's care. Well, that's not true. There are several places in Scripture where the animals are mentioned as objects of God's care. This just might be one of the more explicit of them. What's the point here?
Well, they're part of God's creation.
Yeah.
And he proclaimed that they were good. And he also gave Adam the responsibility of taking care of them and being a steward of the things that God had made.
Yeah, steward is interesting. He just talked about you didn't tend that plant or make it grow. But there's all these people in Nineveh, and they've all got animals that they're tending and they're taking care of. So I think that may be an interesting comparison there. That this Nineveh's part of a creation, part of a larger creation, right? And God's kind of saying to Jonah, your flippant attitude toward these people in this great city demonstrates a problem. Demonstrates that you don't have the same care for the creation as I do. You don't have the same view of creation as I do. Now, again, God was going to destroy Nineveh.
I was going to say, he doesn't tell Jonah he didn't have a right to be angry. But it almost doesn't matter. God had a right to be angry
because he was going to blow them up.
And I think the implied question then is, now, do you have a right to be angry since I have shown them grace and compassion?
Yeah, even in the midst of his anger and in the midst of preparing to carry his sentence out, he showed concern more by telling them about it. So
Yeah. Right.
That's what I'm comforting thing we can take out of this, as angry as God ever gets with us, the care is always there.
And yeah, and God's anger apparently, I'm sure, it's different than ours in a lot of ways, but one of the ways in which it's different is that it does not crowd out compassion and grace. It does not eliminate the possibility of forgiveness. God can be angry with us simultaneously as he shows us grace and compassion and love. Jonah can't manage that. We have a hard time with that too, probably.
That's in our society.
Natalie said it reminds me of the prodigal son.
Reminds you of the prodigal son, yeah, that's a good, interesting comparison, right?
We show this tolerance, except when people have done certain things, and then we say as a society, well, that's unforgivable, forget it, write those people off.
We all have something we all have places in which grace and compassion don't extend very well. And God doesn't really have that. The prodigal son's an interesting comparison because, I mean, Jesus tells that story, right, to religious leaders who, who don't see the joy that God has in finding what is lost and bringing it to safety. And so I think it's a real interesting comparison because Jonah seems to be in the same category. Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah. The gospel writers talk about the sign of Jonah as part of it being 3 days as Jonah was 3 days in the fish, so Jesus will be 3 days in the earth. But I think lurking in the background there is that attitude of some of the religious leaders. That's very similar to Jonah's attitude toward the Assyrians, right? That God's grace doesn't extend that far. And we're the gatekeepers. We're the ones who make sure that no one undesirable gets in. And maybe that, when Jesus says, Jesus talks about how this generation will, the people in Nineveh will stand up and judgment on this generation because the people in Nineveh repented and they won't. So I think Jesus is sort of invoking that whole attitude when he talks about the sign of Jonah.
Yeah, though, there are people who say, even now, or maybe they don't say it, but they come close to saying that, well, if so-and-so's in heaven, I don't want to be there, or contest, it's just not right that Jesus spared the third thief. That's just not fair. And yet, as you were talking about, I mean, the only other instance I can think of a destruction of a city, too, Sodom and Gomorrah, but God ended up being willing to spare them if they could only find a tiny number of righteous people, right, in the town. And here, the whole city apparently repents. I think it's interesting also that there are probably Jews in Nineveh. I mean, Tobit, the story of Tobit was in Nineveh. That's not a factor in this. That's not mentioned here. It's God, even with Sodom and Gomorrah, even though the grace wasn't actually dispensed, there would have been a willingness to do it.
Well, and the striking comparison that's been made by others between Abraham and Jonah. Abraham was the one begging God. Okay, he talks him down, right? 50, 40, 30, 20. That talks him down to 10 righteous people. If we can find 10 righteous people in Sodom, would you spare the city? So Abraham is begging with God to show grace. Here, Jonah is angry because God won't. It's a striking comparison. I think it's got to be intentional. Got to be intended to make us think of that.
I was thinking about this anger still and Jonah, and we made comparisons about children being angry, and I can certainly relate, like Ron is saying, to being so angry, just angry. But is we don't allow children to remain there.
Yeah.
We validate their anger. We say, why are you angry? Do you have a right to be angry? Whatever question we come up with. But then we try to teach how to manage that emotion, that it doesn't cloud or block or blind kindness or forgiveness, and it may take a long time. It may not happen as a parent just talking to a kid right then and there. And as an adult, as I manage my anger, I may not get over it in a day or a week or whatever, but that has to be, I think that's part of that question. Do you have a right to be angry? So to pause and think about it so I can manage what I feel, that it's just not okay. And we wouldn't let our children just be angry, or we would do something to get them to think about it, come up with a way to deal with it. At least that's what I teach in anger management. And I know in the schools in Chicago, we're teaching restorative practices about how to manage and control that. Not that it's wrong to have a feeling and to be angry, but you can't just live in it. It can't be the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you, Colette, about that. But I would also point out that in this instance, and maybe me on the street of New York too, there's a fine line at this point between just anger as I most possibly can be and just despair, right? I mean, you cross, at some point you cross over and things are just too much for you. And, it is nice to rely on God in those situations, to fall back on God. But as Colette knows, there's some people who can't handle that despair or depression either. And I mean, it's just a breaking point for some people. But I agree with you, Colette. I'm not sure. I think we're supposed to sympathize, but Jonah, I think probably can bring himself back. He just doesn't want to. Just like the kids, I'm going to wallow in this for a while and sort of enjoy it, right? Which is what you can see kids and adults sometimes doing. But we do hopefully get ourselves out of it eventually. Hopefully Jonah cooled down on his long, hot road back from Nineveh to Judah. But
I wonder if he went back on the ship.
He might have had a little PTSD going, like he had been through a lot. I don't think his mental health was necessarily great at this point.
You're probably right. Mine wouldn't have been.
Either.
Yeah.
The other similarity that I kind of thought of is Elijah. Elijah had that moment where, I'm the only one left, and now me too. And God kind of says, come on. You think very highly of yourself, Elijah, and reminds him both his calling and God's, what God has done and has been doing. Well, thanks for your thoughts on Jonah. I hope you enjoyed that little book. I will take suggestions as always for what you would like to study or talk about, discuss next in this class. Just let me know, and we'll take it all under advisement. But thanks for your thoughts. It's an interesting little book. It's a very short little book, but man, there's a lot there, a lot of implications. It helps me it reminds me of the bigger vision that God has of the world, and how I can get so provincial in the way I think about my life and His grace and all that.
It's such a vivid book.
It is a
You
vivid book.
see the pictures in your mind of the things that are described, and some books are not like that. It's all dialogue or something.
Yeah, it's vivid.